In the winter corridors of Europe's most troubled royal court, a young queen carried a secret that no record dared speak aloud. Her womb, watched more closely than her mind or her soul, became the silent stage on which a kingdom's fate collapsed. Behind gilded doors and ceremonial smiles, Caroline Matilda of Denmark endured a sequence of tragedies that reshaped her destiny and fed the darkest appetites of royal politics. This is the unsettling story of how a girl married too young, isolated too quickly, and broken too quietly was destroyed not by treason but by grief hidden inside her own body. Caroline Matilda arrived in Denmark in 1766 like a ceremonial offering, not a bride. At 15, she was old enough to understand duty but too young to grasp the depth of the world she was entering. Her marriage to King Christian VII had been arranged with diplomatic precision, a union meant to secure alliances rather than affection. The reception that greeted her was a spectacle of forced enthusiasm, draped in silks and gold but cold beneath the surface. Everyone watched her with the detached curiosity reserved for political objects, valuable but replaceable. The Danish court had anticipated an English princess shaped by elegance and obedience. What they encountered was a quiet, observant girl whose innocence made her stand out among a palace steeped in tension. Her foreignness became the first mark against her. Whispers spread before she even set foot in the Queen's apartments. She was too English, too young, too unfamiliar with the rigid expectations of Copenhagen. Behind every bow and smile lingered suspicion rather than welcome. Christian VII, her new husband, drifted in and out of lucidity from the moment she met him. His charm, fleeting as candlelight, disappeared quickly, replaced by bouts of frantic energy and unpredictable cruelty. He stared at her with vacant eyes, as though she were a stranger trespassing in a space he no longer recognized as his own. Their wedding night passed without intimacy, their early days without companionship. Caroline Matilda soon realized she was not only married to a king, but shackled to a man quietly disintegrating. The palace staff studied her closely, waiting for signs of pregnancy even before her marriage bed had settled into routine. Her body became a subject of conversation, her duties implied before she could adjust to her surroundings. Each morning brought inquiries masked as politeness, probing whether the alliance she carried within her would strengthen the kingdom. She felt the weight of expectation like a stone pressing against her chest, yet she endured with the grace expected of a queen. She learned the rituals, the etiquette, the correct way to walk, speak, and sit in the presence of men who valued her more for potential heirs than for anything she might think or feel. Her isolation was profound. Even her ladies-in-waiting treated her with calculated distance. The chill of Denmark seeped into more than her bones. It settled into her spirit. The pressure soon manifested physically. In the early months of her marriage, Caroline Matilda felt the faintest hope, an indication that she might be with child. The court buzzed with cautious interest, and for once she saw a glimmer of warmth in the faces around her. But the joy was short-lived. Quietly, in her private chambers, without the presence of her husband or comfort from her attendants, she miscarried. The pain pierced her body, but the deeper wound came from knowing she had disappointed a kingdom. The loss was hidden from the public, concealed behind diplomatic courtesy. Only a handful of attendants knew, and none offered counsel or solace. Instead, they exchanged glances heavy with judgment, as though her body's failure were a moral weakness. Caroline Matilda mourned alone, her first silent grief in a lifetime that would soon become defined by such tragedies. It was then, as she lay recovering in a bed too large for her small frame, that the first crack appeared in the fragile identity she had been forced to assume. She understood with chilling clarity. In Denmark, her sorrow was irrelevant. Only her usefulness mattered. From the moment Caroline Matilda resumed her court duties after the hidden miscarriage, the Danish establishment tightened its gaze upon her with suffocating precision. She no longer walked through the palace as a young queen adjusting to marriage, but as a living vessel whose value depended on the promise of an heir. Every corridor felt like a silent tribunal. Every glance seemed to measure her worth in cycles and symptoms. Her attendants observed her with an unsettling mixture of reverence and scrutiny. They noted how long she slept, how much she ate, whether she looked fatigued or flushed. Court physicians, summoned without her consent, examined her under the guise of care but treated her more like livestock than royalty. Their reports were delivered directly to ministers and chamberlains, bypassing the queen entirely. She learned of their assessments only through whispers or altered routines, when a dish disappeared from her meals, when her walks were shortened, when her baths were regulated to precise temperatures. Caroline Matilda felt her identity contract, reduced from princess and queen to biological instrument. Her English upbringing had not prepared her for this level of intrusion. In her homeland, propriety shielded royal women. In Denmark, however, her womb became a matter of state. Ministers spoke of her as though she were a policy, not a person. They debated her fertility with the same detachment they applied to military budgets or diplomatic treaties. Christian VII remained a distant figure in these deliberations, drifting further into instability. When he did appear, he showed little interest in his wife's discomfort. His mood swung between brief, brittle affection and erratic irritability. At times, he clung to her with childish dependency. At others, he recoiled as though she were an intruder. The responsibility of producing an heir fell almost entirely on her shoulders, even though the kingdom quietly questioned whether the king himself was capable of fatherhood. Her isolation deepened with each passing month. The palace's grand rooms, once overwhelming in their formality, now felt like cages gilded to disguise their true nature. She developed a habit of standing by the tall, arched windows overlooking the gardens, one of the few places where the surveillance felt less suffocating. Yet even there, she sensed the watchful eyes of courtiers stationed at a distance, evaluating her posture, her energy, her movements. When signs of a second pregnancy emerged, the court's tension thickened. Physicians increased their visits, offering her regimens meant to safeguard the fragile hope forming within her. They dictated everything: what she should eat, when she should rest, the angle at which she should recline. Her body ceased to feel like her own. The kingdom held it hostage in the name of continuity. This pregnancy, too, failed. It happened in the early hours of a cold morning, when she awakened to a dull ache that soon sharpened into unmistakable pain. There were no attendants nearby. Her privacy had been granted only during hours the court deemed restful. By the time help arrived, the loss was final. The physicians delivered their condolences with the detached efficiency of men accustomed to disappointment. They recorded the outcome in their ledgers while avoiding her eyes. Behind closed doors, the court assigned blame with quiet certainty. Some whispered that her constitution was frail, unfit for the demands of monarchy. Others muttered that her English blood was incompatible with Denmark's future. No one dared accuse Christian VII, though many privately acknowledged his instability and absence. Caroline Matilda absorbed their judgment without protest. Exhaustion hollowed her, leaving her spirit thin and fragile. She understood that her grief was considered secondary to the political consequences of her loss. The second miscarriage confirmed an unspoken fear among the nobles. She was becoming a liability. Her loneliness grew heavier, settling over her like a shroud. She began to sense that the palace was not merely observing her, it was waiting for her to fail again. Waiting for her to justify their distrust. Waiting for her to prove that she was, in the eyes of the Danish court, replaceable. Her sorrow no longer belonged solely to her. It had become ammunition. And the court, ever vigilant, was prepared to use it. Christian VII's decline unfolded like a slow, relentless storm, one that loosened the foundations of the Danish court and trapped Caroline Matilda in a life defined by dread. At first, his instability appeared as harmless eccentricity, sudden bursts of laughter, erratic gestures, conversations that drifted into fragments of nonsense. But as months passed, the harmless veneer dissolved. What remained was a young king tormented by impulses he could neither control nor understand. Caroline Matilda lived in a constant state of anticipation, unsure whether her husband would greet her with fragile tenderness or with hostility sharpened by paranoia. He avoided her for days, then appeared unannounced at her chamber door in the dead of night, demanding conversation or collapsing into fits of agitation. The palace attempted to hide these episodes, but whispers spread easily through corridors lined with servants who saw more than they ever admitted. During public ceremonies, Christian's behavior veered between manic enthusiasm and glaring detachment. He spoke to himself, laughed at moments of solemnity, or stared blankly at diplomats who awaited formal responses. Caroline Matilda stood beside him through these humiliations, her poise masking the growing fear tightening around her heart. She began to understand that Denmark's stability and her own safety rested on the fragile, unpredictable mind of her husband. The court interpreted Christian's episodes as further evidence of the Queen's inadequacy. They believed she failed to calm him, failed to inspire him, failed to anchor him to the world. The pressure weighed on her silently, feeding her anxiety and wearing down her resilience. She spent more time in solitude, retreating into silence when she sensed the footsteps of courtiers who would evaluate her expressions and report their assumptions to the council. By early 1768, Caroline Matilda sensed another pregnancy. The knowledge stirred both hope and dread within her. She longed for a child to protect her position, to anchor her emotionally, to offer her a purpose beyond mere scrutiny. Yet she feared that the violent energy swirling within the palace would threaten the fragile life she carried. She avoided confrontation, limited her movements, and prayed for calm. But Christian's instability only worsened. One night, an episode erupted more violently than any before. The king stormed through the palace in a frenzy, shouting accusations against unseen enemies, knocking over furniture, and startling servants who hid behind columns or fled into side chambers. When he reached the queen's apartments, he ranted incoherently about betrayal, shadows watching him, and voices whispering treason. His agitation filled the room like a physical force. Caroline Matilda stood frozen, her body trembling as she tried to remain composed. The outburst left her shaken long after Christian was escorted away by guards and attendants. Her pulse raced, her breath shallow, the fear sinking into her bones. Hours later, pain coursed through her abdomen, sharp, rhythmic, undeniable. She recognized it instantly, though she prayed she was wrong. But hope offered no refuge. By dawn, the third miscarriage had taken hold. This time, the court did not bother to hide its judgment. Servants exchanged glances thick with condemnation. Court physicians muttered theories about emotional instability affecting her delicate constitution. Some nobles suggested that her inability to bear children reflected divine displeasure with the English alliance. None considered the king's outburst or the climate of fear he created. Caroline Matilda grieved in silence, unable to voice the truth. That terror had lodged itself so deeply within her that her body could no longer hold the fragile beginnings of life. Her sorrow was dismissed as weakness, her suffering interpreted as failure. She stood alone at the edge of a marriage collapsing under the weight of madness, knowing that her place in Denmark grew more precarious with every tremor of the king's unraveling mind. And beneath it all, a new understanding began to stir. Fear was no longer a passing emotion. It was becoming the foundation of her existence. Johann Friedrich Struensee entered the Danish court quietly, without ceremony, as though his presence required no official announcement to alter the fragile balance of power. He had been summoned out of desperation, a foreign physician tasked with stabilizing a king whose mind had become a liability to the realm. Few expected the German doctor to succeed where others had failed. Yet within days, Struensee's calm voice and confident demeanor began to soothe Christian VII's most volatile episodes. His presence rippled through the palace like a shift in atmospheric pressure, subtle but unmistakable. Caroline Matilda first encountered him during one of Christian's calmer periods. The king had requested Struensee accompany him to her chambers, eager to demonstrate the novelty of his newfound composure. When the physician bowed before her, the queen detected neither the stiff subservience of courtiers nor the prying judgment of palace physicians. Instead, he greeted her with genuine courtesy, as if acknowledging her humanity before her title. It was a small gesture, easily overlooked in a court addicted to protocol, but to Caroline Matilda it felt like a lantern flickering in a long corridor of darkness. In the weeks that followed, Struensee's influence grew. He remained officially attached to the king, but his competence drew him into administrative matters. Ministers sought him out, hoping he could interpret Christians' moods or coax the king into brief intervals of clarity. For Caroline Matilda, these developments created a rare pocket of stability. With Struensee present, Christian's outbursts were less frequent, his suspicions less venomous, and his emotional storms less destructive. The queen found herself breathing more easily, though she dared not confess it aloud. Their interactions remained formal, yet a delicate understanding began to take shape, a recognition that both lived under the weight of a king's unraveling mind. When Struensee addressed her, his words carried the tone of someone who saw beyond the crown and into the silent suffering beneath it. He never spoke of her miscarriages, but she sensed he understood the grief that haunted her. His compassion, unspoken yet palpable, unsettled her more than any accusation the court could devise. As Struensee's presence strengthened the facade of royal normalcy, the court reacted with suspicion. Nobles regarded him as an interloper, a foreigner wielding influence beyond his station. They whispered that the queen favored him too openly, though her interactions with him remained entirely proper. Rumors thrived in the void left by Christian's instability. The palace was accustomed to seeing threats everywhere, and Struensee became a convenient target. During this period of tension, Caroline Matilda experienced faint signs of another pregnancy. The knowledge filled her with conflicting emotions, hope mingled with dread. She confided in no one. The court had weaponized her body before. She would not give them another chance to dissect her hopes. She maintained her duties, concealing her exhaustion beneath the practiced composure expected of a queen. But fate, once again, refused to grant her peace. The fourth miscarriage struck quietly, almost mercifully, without the violent pain of the previous losses. Yet the emotional blow was deeper than before. She felt the life slip away before she could fully imagine it, leaving her hollow and trembling in the solitude of her chambers. When Struensee learned of her condition, through the same whispering channels that fed every secret of the palace, he visited her under the pretext of medical inquiry. His expression held no judgment, only a silent recognition of her suffering. He offered no platitudes, no promises, only a steady presence that eased her trembling for the first time in years. In that moment, a bond formed, not romantic, not ambitious, but born of shared endurance within a court that devoured the vulnerable. It was a bond the palace would misinterpret with lethal consequences. The winter of 1769 settled over Copenhagen with a heaviness that mirrored the atmosphere inside the royal palace. The arrival of Johann Friedrich Struensee had shifted the balance of power, but it was only now, months after he first calmed the king's violent outbursts, that the full consequences of his influence began to unfurl. Struensee was no longer merely a foreign physician. He had become the one person who could reach Christian VII's fractured mind. And through the king, the entire kingdom began to bend, slowly, insistently, toward the doctor's will. Caroline Matilda watched the transformation with a blend of fascination and fear. For the first time since her forced arrival in Denmark, policies were being drafted that aimed to ease the lives of commoners rather than punish them. Harsh decrees were softened. Surveillance of the people was reduced. Censorship loosened just enough for public discourse to breathe again. But these reforms did not carry the king's voice. They belonged to Struensee, the quiet, sharp-eyed physician who had stepped into a political void and filled it with reason masked as royal authority. Within the palace walls, however, reason did not prevail. Suspicion did. The nobles saw a foreigner gaining power at a pace that defied custom. They whispered that Struensee manipulated the queen, that Caroline Matilda had allowed him too close. They claimed her recent miscarriage, her fourth, was evidence of divine anger, a punishment for some imagined intimacy. Such accusations traveled through the corridors like cold drafts, unwelcome yet impossible to ignore. Caroline heard them, of course. Even when courtiers pretended to bow respectfully, she could sense the judgment behind their downcast eyes. Her body, already weakened by repeated trauma, felt like an object under inspection. as if her worth could be measured by the pregnancy she could not carry to term. Every loss was catalogued by priests, dissected by midwives, and tallied against her as proof that she was unfit to be queen. But Struensee treated her differently. He did not speak to her as a symbol or a vessel or a royal wife whose usefulness depended on producing heirs. He spoke to her as a human being who had endured more sorrow than a girl of her age should have known. Their conversations, at first clinical, gradually deepened into something more personal. Not improper, not yet, but dangerous enough to threaten the fragile order of the court. Late in the evenings, when Christian VII drifted into restless sleep, Struensee and the Queen discussed the future of Denmark, education, reforms, the possibility of a more enlightened monarchy. Their shared ideas knitted them into an alliance stronger than either realized. In a palace where truth was perilous and affection nearly extinct, even intellectual companionship felt like rebellion. This companionship soon became visible. When the Queen supported one of Struensee's policies, the court saw seduction. When the king leaned on the doctor's counsel, the nobles saw usurpation. And when Caroline Matilda appeared in public less frequently after her miscarriage, rumors swelled that she was hiding shame tied to the foreign physician. The Queen, still mourning the child she had lost, felt the tightening noose of political hatred. Her grief no longer belonged to her. It had become a weapon in the hands of her enemies. They twisted it into evidence, into motive, into scandal. Yet beneath the fear and isolation, something long dormant began to stir within her, a quiet rebellion. Caroline Matilda, once a timid girl trapped by royal duty, now sensed the possibility of reclaiming her life, piece by fragile piece. Her alliance with Struensee was dangerous. But it was also the first thing in years that felt like hope. The year 1771 arrived with a breath of desperation threaded through every hallway of the Danish court. For months, Caroline Matilda had lived in a fragile state between dread and determination. After 4 miscarriages, 4 silent wounds carved into her young life, her body had become a battlefield of fear. But when she discovered she was pregnant again, something inside her hardened. She refused to collapse beneath the weight of her past. She would carry this child. She had to. Struensee, now the most powerful figure behind the throne, approached the news with a caution she understood too well. He examined her quietly, advising rest, privacy, and freedom from the court's watchful eyes. But privacy was impossible. The palace felt like a living creature, its walls listening, its courtiers waiting for the slightest misstep. Whispers slithered through corridors, tracking her condition as if her womb were public property. For once, Christian VII showed a kind of bewildered optimism. In his confused mind, the idea of a royal heir flickered like an unstable flame. Some days he forgot she was pregnant, other days he spoke of the child with feverish excitement. Caroline Matilda learned not to trust his reactions. She had long ago stopped expecting protection from her own husband. Still, the pregnancy progressed. Every month became a milestone celebrated only within her private thoughts. Struensee monitored her health with relentless care, keeping detailed notes, adjusting her regimen, shielding her when palace tensions spiked. Their connection deepened in those months, not through scandalous rendezvous, but through shared survival. He had become the one constant presence in her life, a quiet force pushing back against despair. But their closeness, innocent or not, fed the court like a hidden fire. By autumn, nobles were already preparing their accusations. They noted how often Struensee visited her. They counted the days of the king's disordered absence. They analyzed the queen's glow, calling it suspicious. They spoke as if a woman who had lost child after child could not possibly conceive without some foreign intervention, some foreign man. Caroline Matilda pretended not to hear them. Her entire focus narrowed to one goal: bring this child into the world alive. On a bitter January morning, after a long and grueling labor that left her trembling and bloodless, she heard the fragile cry of her daughter. Princess Louise Augusta, a name chosen with regal elegance, but the sound of it sliced through Caroline's heart like sunlight. She held the tiny bundle against her chest, inhaling the newborn warmth, and for a moment, just one moment, she felt triumph. She had done it. She had beaten the grief that had haunted her for years. But outside the birthing chamber, celebrations soured into suspicion almost instantly. Before the blood on the sheets had dried, courtiers exchanged looks sharpened with triumph of a different kind. Rumors uncoiled like serpents. The child is not the king's. The child is Struensee's. Look at the timing. Look at the closeness. Even midwives, pressured by noble factions, whispered that the baby's features were difficult to attribute. Caroline Matilda sensed the danger as soon as she rose from her bed days later. Smiles offered to her in public were hollow. Conversations fell silent when she entered. Every noblewoman stared too long at the infant's face, as if searching for foreign marks. Her past miscarriages were resurrected as evidence. She could never carry the king's child, they muttered. This one must belong to another. Instead of bringing stability, the birth had tightened the snare around her. Motherhood, once her salvation, had become her greatest vulnerability. The winter of 1771 settled over Copenhagen like a shroud, thick and suffocating, but the cold inside the palace was far more lethal than anything outside its walls. Caroline Matilda felt it the moment she resumed her royal duties. The air around her had changed. It had weight, shape, intention. Every bow lasted a second too long. Every whisper died too quickly. Every smile from the nobles curved like a hidden blade. For months, resentment had been quietly fermenting among the Danish aristocracy. Struensee's reforms, bold, modern, and threatening, had stripped many of them of influence and wealth. His unprecedented control over the king's decrees made them furious. But what enraged them most was the one vulnerability they believed could destroy him entirely: the queen. They began gathering in clusters behind locked doors, under candlelit ceilings stained with tobacco smoke. Count Ronso led the whispers, fueled by his personal hatred for Struensee. Ove Hoe Guldberg, the calculating court theologian, provided moral justification. And Queen Juliana Maria, Christian's stepmother, supplied the venomous ambition. Together, they formed a coalition united by one goal: eliminate Struensee by turning Caroline Matilda into a symbol of treason and immorality. The queen became their spectacle of destruction. Her miscarriages were pulled from the shadows, twisted into accusations. She was never meant to bear the king's heirs, one noblewoman proclaimed. Why? Because she shared her bed elsewhere. Midwives were interrogated, maids were bribed. A dressmaker was coerced into claiming she witnessed secret meetings between the queen and Struensee, meetings that never existed. Letters were forged. Timelines were manipulated. Even her grief was weaponized. The birth of Princess Louise Augusta, instead of silencing doubts, gave new life to the conspiracy. Guldberg declared that the child's conception aligned too perfectly with Struensee's growing presence near the queen. Ronso insisted the infant's features leaned toward German blood, a claim built entirely on xenophobic fiction, but eagerly accepted by the conspirators. Caroline Matilda noticed the subtle shift in the palace. Guards stiffened as she passed. Servants avoided her eyes. Courtiers scribbled notes in corners, pretending to document schedules while recording her movements. Every door she opened revealed someone who had just finished whispering her name. She warned Struensee in a trembling voice that danger was approaching, but he, blinded by duty and a desire to push his reforms through before they collapsed, underestimated the malice gathering around them. "We have truth on our side," he told her gently. But truth meant nothing in a court built on power. By New Year's Eve, the conspirators were ready. Christian VII, fragile and impressionable, was manipulated into believing his wife plotted against him. They fed him lies wrapped in religious rhetoric, poisoning what little stability remained in his mind. The king, confused but frightened, agreed to give authority to the conspirators for the preservation of the kingdom. It was all they needed. On the freezing night of January 17, 1772, the palace erupted with violent purpose. Boots thundered through corridors. Torches lit the walls with trembling flames. Guards stormed the queen's chambers without warning. Caroline Matilda, roused from sleep by the pounding of fists on her door, had only seconds to understand what was happening. Two soldiers tore her infant daughter from her arms. A scream, raw, animal, unforgettable, ripped from her throat. She reached for Louise Augusta, but the child was already disappearing down the corridor, swallowed by the armored wave. Cold shackles snapped around the Queen's wrists. The conspiracy had succeeded. The Queen of Denmark had fallen. Caroline Matilda entered the courtroom under the oppressive weight of the palace's judgment, the chill of marble floors sinking through her thin gown into her bones. The space was formal, grand, and utterly merciless, every column and tapestry a reminder of the wealth and power that now conspired against her. She walked with measured steps, though inside, a storm of fear and grief raged. The conspirators had designed the trial not to uncover truth, but to crush her spirit entirely, to turn the Queen into an example of obedience through humiliation. From the moment proceedings began, her miscarriages were weaponized. Physicians, summoned as experts, detailed her unnatural constitution in precise clinical terms. They described her body as fragile, erratic, incapable of sustaining life, a subtle indictment that implied both failure and moral deficiency. Their reports were read aloud, each word like a scalpel cutting at her dignity. The courtroom absorbed every syllable, and she felt the eyes of ministers, nobles, and clergy drilling into her like punishment incarnate. Court ladies provided testimony that dripped with insinuation. They spoke of how the Queen invited immorality through gestures and conversations, a veiled accusation amplified by the fact that Struensee's influence was already considered corrupting. Every smile she had exchanged with the physician, every private discussion about governance was interpreted as evidence of impropriety. The accusations carried no proof, yet the weight of collective authority made them truths in the minds of the jury and the public, watching through the lens of rumor. Priests were brought forward to weave moral and divine judgment into the proceedings. They declared that her miscarriages were signs of divine displeasure, that the repeated losses of unborn children signified punishment for sins the court dared not name directly. Each sermon-like statement, delivered with calm conviction, hammered into her the idea that her suffering was both deserved and permanent. Caroline Matilda remained silent, her eyes fixed on a distant point, refusing to react, though inside every syllable seared her pride and hope. The trial progressed with an inevitability designed to break her. Evidence was selected to humiliate, witnesses coached to imply guilt, and arguments framed to ensure that the Queen could not defend herself without incriminating Struensee or herself. The political machinery that had tolerated Christian VII's instability now turned with ruthless precision, stripping her of agency while claiming it preserved the monarchy. She understood that innocence was irrelevant. Her body, her grief, her loyalty, all were tools to manipulate public opinion. Struensee's fate was sealed first. Despite his service, his intellect, and his loyalty to reform, the court condemned him to execution. Caroline Matilda, powerless to intervene, could only watch as the man who had offered her compassion and stability was removed from her life forever. His death was both punishment and warning, a demonstration that influence without protection was deadly. Finally, the Queen herself was stripped of rank, title, and authority. The verdict required no proof beyond the collective fear of nobles and the fragile king's compliance. Condemned to exile, Caroline Matilda was denied both justice and mercy. The court presented her punishment as a sacrifice to stabilize a kingdom teetering on chaos, yet its cruelty left no shadow of truth in its reasoning. She departed the courtroom quietly, bearing the knowledge that every miscarriage, every whispered suspicion, every moment of her vulnerability had been twisted into evidence against her. Alone in the echoing corridors, she felt the machinery of power grinding her life into fragments, and for the first time, the full scale of her isolation became undeniable. Celle Castle rose from the northern German plains like a silent sentinel, its cold stone walls absorbing and reflecting the sorrow of the exiled Queen. Caroline Matilda arrived under strict guard, her rank stripped, her attendants reduced to a handful of indifferent servants. The journey from Copenhagen had been long and isolating, and every mile deepened the sense that she was leaving not only her homeland, but the fragments of her identity she had struggled to preserve. She stepped into exile as a young woman who had already endured more grief than most experienced in a lifetime. Inside the castle, routine replaced freedom. Meals were served at rigid hours, the halls patrolled by silent guards, and correspondence carefully monitored, censored, or ignored. Letters sent to her children or former allies vanished into bureaucratic limbo, leaving Caroline Matilda with the unyielding knowledge that her voice, once commanding as queen, now held no power. The child she had carried, Princess Louise Augusta, remained in Denmark, removed from her arms as though the child were a political instrument rather than her flesh and blood. Each separation reinforced the cruel lesson that her body had been a battlefield for political warfare, and every miscarriage a wound exploited for gossip and manipulation. The castle's stone walls were indifferent to her grief. Their cold surfaces and echoing corridors provided no comfort, no solace. Caroline wandered these spaces like a ghost, her presence barely acknowledged by the few attendants tasked with her care. She traced the lines of the architecture with her mind, memorizing the chill, the shadows, and the silence, as if documenting the shape of her confinement for posterity. In the quiet, memories of her miscarriages haunted her, each loss replayed in vivid clarity, amplified by solitude. The grief she had once hidden from the Danish court now became her sole companion. She spent long hours in reflection, measuring the years that had been stolen from her. Her youth, her aspirations, her brief taste of influence, all had been stripped away. Caroline Matilda contemplated the mechanics of power that had turned her life into a spectacle of suffering, the king's instability, the manipulations of nobles, the court's obsession with her fertility. Each memory was a thread in a tapestry of injustice, woven with deliberate cruelty. Her mind, once focused on survival and governance, now dwelled on the relentless, intimate betrayals that had defined her short life. Occasionally, she found small reprieves in the routine she could control. She walked in the castle gardens when the frost permitted, tending to tiny, manageable tasks that no one could exploit. She read letters and books from her own small library, though the absence of responses from her children or allies reminded her that the world beyond the walls continued without her. In these moments, the enormity of her isolation struck with new intensity. She was present yet invisible, alive yet forgotten. Time in exile was both relentless and stagnant. Each day stretched without distinction, a monotonous reminder that the court's judgment had effectively erased her existence. Yet beneath the despair, Caroline Matilda nurtured a quiet resilience. Her grief was unrelenting, but it became a source of endurance, a reason to exist within a prison that sought to annihilate her spirit. The cold stones of Celle Castle bore witness to her sorrow, recording the life of a queen stripped of power, dignity, and family, yet refusing entirely to vanish from history's memory. In the solitude of exile, Caroline Matilda's life became an echo of what had been stolen, a body haunted, a heart isolated, a mind perpetually aware of the cruelty that had defined her youth. And in that echo, the shadows of her losses lingered, unmoving yet unbroken, as the castle itself seemed to mourn her. By 1775, Caroline Matilda had grown into a shadow of her former self. At just 23, her body bore the toll of repeated miscarriages, emotional trauma, and relentless political persecution. Exile had stripped her of wealth, power, and family. Her daughter, once the center of her hope, remained across the sea, raised under the careful, watchful eyes of a court that had condemned her mother. The young queen, who had arrived in Denmark full of life and promise, now moved quietly through the cold corridors of Celle Castle, a ghost living among stone walls that knew no mercy. Her days were measured by a regimen of solitude and ritual: breakfast at the same hour, walks along the frost-laden gardens, hours spent reading from the few books she had managed to retain. Guards observed her silently, servants performed duties without connection, and letters remained unanswered, absorbed into the bureaucratic void. She learned that the world outside the castle moved on without her, and that her grief, though vast and unrelenting, was invisible to those who had destroyed her life. Every miscarriage, every humiliation, every betrayal haunted her relentlessly, a cycle that had begun as a child bride and would end in isolation. Caroline Matilda often wandered the castle's shadowed halls at night, the echoes of her footsteps, a private rhythm of remembrance. She recalled each moment of her life in Denmark, the forced marriage at 15, the king's unpredictability, the miscarriages that had hollowed her womb and her spirit, the arrival of Struensee and his fleeting companionship, the birth of her daughter that became the tool of conspirators, and finally the arrests, the trial, and the exile. Each memory was vivid, sharper than the frost outside, and each recalled sorrow cut anew. There was no audience for her pain, no witness to her suffering, only the stone walls that bore it silently. Even as her health waned, Caroline Matilda maintained a fragile routine, her dignity preserved in the only way she could control. She read, she wrote, and she moved deliberately, holding the remnants of herself together in a world that had sought to erase her. Yet the years of physical strain and emotional torment had left her body vulnerable. Fever, weakness, and the lingering effects of her miscarriages claimed her slowly, relentlessly. No physician of Struensee's caliber remained, no advocate of her humanity was left. She faced mortality with the same quiet endurance she had used to endure life's cruelties. In her final days, Caroline Matilda's thoughts returned, inevitably, to Denmark. She imagined her daughter, now approaching adolescence, and felt the bitter weight of absence and powerlessness. She mourned not only the loss of her own children, but the life she had been denied, the influence she could never exercise, the love she could never fully protect. The political forces that had condemned her were long gone from her immediate awareness, but their shadow remained, persistent and suffocating. Her story had been dictated by others, her body a battlefield, her grief a public spectacle. On a quiet evening, as candlelight flickered across the cold walls, Caroline Matilda drew her final breath. Alone, unaccompanied by family, estranged from her homeland, she passed with a calm that belied the years of terror, sorrow, and humiliation. Her body, long marked by loss, was now free from the machinations that had dictated her existence. In that silence, the castle itself seemed to acknowledge her departure, a final witness to the life of a queen destroyed not by war or natural disaster, but by a world that measured women solely by the capacity of their wombs. Her legacy was one of quiet endurance, haunting in its lesson. Caroline Matilda had lived and suffered under the full weight of history's cruelty, a young woman whose worth had been assessed only in relation to fertility, obedience, and political utility. And yet, in that tragic existence, there remained a story that survived, a story of grief, resilience, and the indelible human cost of power wielded without conscience.